week's is called the Most Influential Survey, and that is a reference to the English Housing Survey, which has been published, or the first form of it has been published in the last week or so, and it is indeed the most influential survey as far as government is concerned. So if you haven't listened to one of these before, you won't know, but I like to start with a quote. And this week's quote is, "There is no greater harm than that of time wasted." And that's from Michelangelo. That's the actual real Michelangelo, not the Ninja Turtle, just for reference. So before we get started, I want to urge you to get your tickets for the next Property Business Workshop. It's on Thursday the 16th of January. And this time Rod and I will be covering productivity, planning, financial accounting and bookkeeping. Why are we doing that? Well, because we constantly see property businesses struggling with appropriate financial reporting, accounting, bookkeeping, and making the same mistakes time and time again. The idea is to help you get a complete handle on the financial performance of your company or group when you aren't at a level yet where you can afford a CFO or financial controller. Set up correctly once and then just iterate from there. As always, it will be an action-packed, content-filled day which will stand alone in helping to advance your understanding as a property business owner. There are still early bird tickets. They have a 10+% discount on face value, and they're live at bit.ly/PBWFIVE. So welcome to the supplement. My geek freak went into overdrive this week when I realised the English Housing Survey was out, a little earlier than usual, so that sorted out the deep dive very quickly. Buckle up, because this is the survey that holds far more sway than anything else when it comes to government policy. It always runs by tax financial year, so it takes us up to March 2024, and it uses data and responses from over that 12-month period between April 23 and March 24. The overall headline in terms of recent house price news is surprise. Not for Propenomix listeners, but to the rest of the world. We've also flip-flopped into that position I took earlier than many commentators before 2023 regarding growth forecasts. Woefully short all year in the face of a very good start to 2024 economically. Now all the big boys and girls are too slow in recognising that the predicted 2% growth for GDP growth in 2025, that's the OBR's prediction, has no chance. Unemployment also looks a bit rocky, although the big dogs at Reed, recruitment agents, talking their own book, isn't quite enough to sound the recession klaxons just yet. Not for me, anyway. Onwards, intrepid Propenomix people then. Chris Watkin asked himself that question one more time. What is currently happening in the UK property market? The headlines will tell you that prices are roaring forward, although that's a bit more backward looking than they suggest, generally. But let's see what Chris's real-time efforts tell us. Listings calmed down to 24,600 last week, which is again what we expect as we get to that time of year into December, but still the second highest print for this week of the year in the past 8 years, only surpassed by 2018. We moved to nearly 1.65 million listings for this year, and we'll clearly top 1.7 million because we've got 4 reporting weeks still to go. You can't tell me those 1.65 million listings are not influenced by landlords listing stock for sale. But there we go. Price reductions stayed high, we're measuring by percentage, and agents are talking vendors who want to sell into cutting their prices. 14% reduced in November, and that's compared to the long-term average of 10.6%. So that's measured on a monthly basis, so 1 in 7 houses was reduced in November. Get them sold or get them off the books in January. That's the way of the industry. Sold subject to contracts, 22,800, far higher than 2023. 20% higher for the equivalent week in 23, and we're even further ahead of the pre-COVID averages than we have been before. So we're 8.8% above the 2017 to 2019 year to date now on sold subject to contract. Fall through stayed well under control. I think we can now put the budget to bed on that front now. The fall through rate was 40% for 2 months after the trust quartering Mets of 2022. The 7-year average is 24.2%, so about 1 in 4 deals falling through, and we had 23.8% last week. This market's accepted the changes, and it's keeping calm and carrying on at this time. Net sales still look healthy. A solid print on the year, 6.3% above the pre-pandemic average of 2017 to 19. Now finally, we're seeing the stamp bumps talked about in the wider media as well. And we're going to be watching out for the reintroduction of the 2% band from 125 to 250k and the 5% band from 300 to 425 for first-time buyers. My view is quite simple. Don't get involved in the scrum, stick to your guns, negotiate hard after April the 1st. Counterintuitive? Of course it is. Do the same as everyone else, expect the same results. At least double the discount on the basis of the extra transaction cost. Trust me, I've done this before. Little tip about sales though, if you're listing anything and are going on Boxing Day, make sure that the estate agent's office is open and taking inquiries that day. Otherwise, just list in the first week of January after the kids are back at school. On the investment side, I'm still seeing and hearing more tumbleweed for the vendors right now up until Christmas time. Stay keen, keep your eyes open. There's bargains out there and a ton of lotted stock at auction that isn't even being viewed, let alone offered on. This window of opportunity won't last long, but press your advantages if you're buying. Auction primarily is where I'm seeing that, but that's because that's a big focus of our operation. But open market shouldn't be much different. Plenty are pulling stock because the market is so limp and expectations are not being managed. So from the real-time desk to the macro then. Nationwide and Halifax caused a bit of a stir with their bumper reports about November. Eye-watering prints upwards. We need to take a look. We also had the final PMIs for November, and they diverged by a reasonable amount from the flash numbers. The final reports also contain better and more meaningful commentary. So we also have to have a look at construction PMIs, of course. Then the retail sales monitor collapsed, so we just have to talk about that instead of the BBA mortgage rate, which I'll wait until next week on. We closed then, of course, with the gilts and the swaps in a wobbly week for France, which has had a minor impact on our gilt markets too. So the house price indices nationwide are always first out of the traps and release their figures on Monday. The wider expectation was 0.2% upwards from November, but they printed 1.2% upwards instead for the month and 3.7% on the year. It's a good job that in December 2023 they didn't say prices are likely to record another small decline, low single digits, or remain broadly flat over the course of 2024. But they did. But you knew that anyway. Nationwide are 1% below their all-time peak, which means nothing at all in these inflationary times. Judging house prices nominally is a nonsense, but it's a nonsense that the system continues to propagate. Nationwide cite their favourite graph of FTB mortgage payments as a percentage of take-home pay. I'm not sure about the provenance of this graph overall, but we don't get a good look under the hood here. It uses UK Finance and ONS data along with the Nationwide's own data. That's all we're told. The chief economist at Nationwide dismisses the idea that the upcoming stamp duty changes are having any impact yet, and you'd have to agree with him. He uses words like resilient to describe the market, citing the mortgage approvals figure as discussed last week. He also points out the relatively low level of household debt levels as good news, which it is, lower than pre-2005. So we're going back before just the ZERP era, the very low rate era. He does mention the distortionary effect of the stamp duty changes in Q1's market for 2025. He's calling a particular March jump in transactions, which I would absolutely agree with. And then he sees weakness in the market after that, taking 3 to 6 months to play out after March. He doesn't say that will be concentrated in April, but primarily it will from experience. The Nationwide chat is now they expect the economy to continue to recover steadily. This is almost noble in its attempted apoliticality, but I feel I need to speak. The reality is the economy was doing really well in the first half of 2024, and I was very frustrated at the time as one of the only people who predicted it and was talking about it. We then had an election, and economic performance has flatlined. It really is the big variable that has changed. Overall private sector chatter has gone relatively negative, but also relatively pragmatic. The public sector will be even more bloated than ever, which will lead to some growth, but the real engine of the economy, the services industry, is already currently cutting recruitment, considering freezing hiring, and some are, of course, even cutting jobs already. That will be the economic narrative for 2025, and at this time the Labour Party have had their fingers in their ears because they don't want to hear it. Reform has overtaken the Labour Party in a poll this week, nearly unthinkable, but Starmer is just playing right into Farage's hands. Now, before I get too political, let me make one thing clear. I'm limiting this to an economic assessment of capability. Labour have not impressed at this point. They are ideologically inspired to take from business rather than the people. But the problem is business pays 80% of the people. So you take from one, you take from the other. Reform's manifesto pledges for the economy were wonderfully populist, but I genuinely would see the gilt rate up at about 6.5% at an absolute minimum if they tried to enact them, if not closer to 8%. And that really would jam up the housing market and lead to some fairly major economic problems. But listen, they've got 4 or more years to grow up and get a proper handle on how to run a country's finances. My hope is that they try, because the political direction of travel worldwide is very, very clear at the moment. Enough, though, as we enjoy the most stable government in Europe at this time, regardless of their competence. And breathe. Halifax, not to be outdone by Nationwide, they went up 1.3% for November, and this took their annualised figure for 4.8%. Thank goodness they didn't predict that prices would fall 4% in 2024, otherwise they'd look silly, wouldn't they, at this point? Although they did predict that. Of course they did, but you knew that. Their number for an average house is now £298,083, and they are above their 2022 previous records. Their head of mortgages also cites affordability constraints, as Nationwide are keen to do. They don't talk about whether this is because of the stress test, though, either of them, which I find infuriating because I'd like to know the real data, and clearly it is quite a bit about the stress test. In my view, this is just poor reporting. Amanda Bryden, their head of mortgages, is less bullish on the economy. She describes a changeable economic backdrop. Now that to me sounds fair. She then talks of positive employment figures, which as of today looks unlikely, unless she means the direction of wages, which is still set to continue upwards, but with some challenges without a doubt. And she talks of anticipated decreases in interest rates. I'm not sure about either of those, as I've been saying for a number of weeks now. Northern Ireland continues to rule the roost at 6.8% upwards as the Brexit bonanza continues. Wales is doing okay, according to Halifax, up 4.1%. The North West and the West Midlands pressed on at plus 5.9 and plus 5.5 respectively over the last 12 months. And Halifax have London at 3.5% up compared to the same time in 2023. So the last 5 months, according to Halifax, plus 0.9, plus 0.3, plus 0.3, plus 0.4, plus 1.3. Exceedingly healthy, although the underlying drivers are now in trouble. There's no context to where real house prices are, for example. Still, this is what will be inspiring buyers or not, persuading them to get on the ladder before things go up even further. Anyone waiting on the basis they were told by all the forecasters, well, not all, that 2024 was a down year, will by now have had time to change their minds. Okay, enough on prices. We knew they were going up. I said they were going up. They've gone up. The big boys have caught up. There we go. How about the finalised PMIs as we concern ourselves with just how changeable the economic landscape is? We have to start with services because they make up by far the largest part of the composite index. And the composite printed 50.5 against an expectation of 49.9. So it just about kept the car in drive rather than reverse, but probably only first gear. Services flashed at 50, but printed 50.8 in the end, thankfully. The headlines, the big one was business optimism drops to its lowest level since December 2022, which was pretty ropey at the time, if you recall. And then the sub-headlines, marginal overall rise in business activity in November. Of course, we were hoping for more after the budget had deferred some decisions, of course. Staffing numbers decreased for the second month running. That bodes badly for unemployment from a percentage perspective anyway. And then on the river, weakest output growth projections for nearly 2 years. Reading all of this, I'd have economic growth pegged more closer to 1% next year, rather than the 2% the OBR have said. And I'm almost inclined to predict under 1%. Now that's not a recession, of course, but this is no longer getting carried away with 1 month's numbers. This is 3 months of steady decline in the PMIs. It's all a little concerning. I keep reminding myself that government spending is growing, and that's why the economy will still give the mirage of moving forward, although I can't see real household disposable incomes doing much in the face of this sort of PMI report. Public sector workers will be okay, though, of course. Perhaps companies need more time to plan and are waiting for their strategic plans for 2025. Let's try and be positive. It's not easy in the private sector at this time. Does the S&P Economics Director give us any reasons to be cheerful in his take? Not really. Weaker sales pipelines, cutbacks on new projects, more caution among clients, pressure on margins mean people aren't replacing staff who are leaving, and that's the first port of call in these sorts of situations. Input prices were up faster than for over 6 months. New higher cost bases are being taken into account. There's not a chink of light in the write-up. It's very gloomy and feels quite recessionary. Like I said, remember the public sector growth before we start crying wolf. Some already are, but those are the people who predicted 19 of the last 2 recessions, and they missed both of the two recessions that actually happened in their predictions. Manufacturing was, though, unlike services, worse than the flash print. 48.6 was the flash, 48.0 was the final reading. A comfortable contraction. This is a 9-month low with new orders falling, output contracting, cost concerns and job cuts, and supply chain stresses. Yuck. Exporting looks weak, international demand is falling, smallest companies are the hardest hit. Supply chain concerns are higher. Rising costs are of course mentioned once again. Inflation once again rears its head in this report. A shame, to say the least. Construction, though, is a different story and carrying the PMIs in terms of optimism at the moment. However, as per the story for most of 2024, this is not residential or house building construction leading the charge. We've had the strongest rise in commercial construction activity for 2.5 years, which is great. Commercial leads. House building activity declines at the sharpest pace since June when you get under the hood. But you know what? It's November. Maybe that's just why. Who wants to be building heavily over Christmas? The whole print of 55.2 suggests a sector that is roaring, really robust expansion. But new orders and job creation have lost momentum. They haven't gone backwards, they're just not going forwards as quickly. The S&P Economics Director describes all this as lopsided. Positive sentiment has dropped to the lowest since October 2023 regarding the next 12 months. You could read all this and worry it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, but the reality of raising 20 billion from the private sector and 5 billion from the public sector, which isn't a raise at all, of course, is that unsurprisingly, it hurts. The global PMIs look more promising for November, so perhaps at least the export market will pick up. Enough gloom on the PMI front. No one's happy about any of that. The BRC Retail Sales Monitor had to make it into the supplement this week because it cratered. However, it was a bit of a non-headline because Black Friday was the last working day of November, so those figures fall into December. It's just how the figures work. Still, the BRC cited rising energy bills and low consumer confidence. The number now being cited for the national insurance rises, alongside new packaging levies, and remember there's an increase in business rates as well, is £7 billion to the retail industry. Are the packaging levies about levelling up Amazon with the high street, or paying the true cost of delivery? It's been positioned about more than about sustainability than anything, but of course, handily for the government and at the cost of all of us, it does raise some tax money. Black Friday did do well as it goes, 6.7% up on footfall, and sales up 5.5% on non-food. One other point was this year, Black Friday was after payday rather than before. It's always worth observing those anomalies. So retailers are therefore not as glum as the November figures suggest, but I do appreciate that shoppers are still constrained by reduced household budgets. But that leaves the gilts then. We couldn't make it another down week for the yields, could we? No. But it didn't move up much. Indeed, we tested 4.05 on the 5-year UK gilt yield on the downside, but we opened at 4.082 and closed at 4.139. It looks reasoned and pretty fair at this point in proceedings, is what I'd say. The 5-year swap closed at 3.814, keeping our best guess mortgage rates for 5-year fixed limited company buy-to-let at 5.8 at the moment, no fee. But I'm sticking with 6% for my deal stackers at the moment. The yield curve's a bit annoying at the moment as it goes. Check your 7-year fix options, because in theory they should be cheaper, but the market is less liquid and demand is much lower, so they won't be, but you should look. The cheapest part of the yield curve for the borrowers at the moment is at 3 years and at 6 years. But the departure between the 10-year gilt at 4.28 and the 10-year swap 3.775 is over 0.5% a year. It's seriously notable, so 10-year fixes are worth a look at the moment as well. There just doesn't seem to be that much swap demand in the marketplace, is the only conclusion I can draw. So gilts and swaps back in their box for another week then, closely monitored, always. So the deep dive, the English Housing Survey 2023 to 24, a geek's paradise. First up, understand what we're getting now and then what we're going to get later. So this is the first release of data from the 2023-24 survey. The report will be followed by 2 more chapters on housing quality and energy efficiency in January, and then a series of more detailed topic reports in the spring and summer of 2025. That's the speed of the blob for you folks. Still, let's tuck into the key findings of what we have got. I'm going to try and draw some conclusions as if I didn't know anything about the sector but was a government minister. I'm going to label these as WMICs, well-meaning idiots' conclusions. Owner occupation remained at 65% of households. Social rent 16%, PRS 19%. A similar proportion than since 2013 to 14. So those shouting that the PRS is shrinking, like me, are wrong, apparently. Apart from the fact I'm convinced that I'm right, but it hasn't showed up in the data for the year end March 24 quite yet. But I would be stunned if we're not at or below 18% in the 24-25 English Housing Survey when that does become available. But we've got 12 more months. WMIC, nothing to see here. There are 1.2 million vacant dwellings at the time of the survey, 5% of the dwellings in England. Let that sink in. Tragedy, opportunity, travesty, plenty of other words you could use to describe that. Second bullet point, anyone in housing reading that and not seeing it as the opportunity of a government or a lifetime is a blithering idiot. WMIC, cool, that sounds like a lot. Can we do anything about it? Must put it on the list to check it out. The percentage of households with savings is still more than it was before the pandemic. 85% for outright owners, 71% for those with a mortgage, 52% of private renters, 28% of social renters. WMIC, well, what I might expect, I suppose. At least half of renters do have savings. Households reported higher mortgage and rental costs. No kidding. Also, the sun rose in the east and set in the west. But average mortgage payments weekly were up £71 a week in London and £47 a week in the rest of England, which is congruent with the £200 a month figure, or thereabouts, that the Bank of England was quoting about a year ago. In comparison to the 2018-19 survey, which is 5 years ago, private rents are up £36 a week and social rents are up £16 a week. WMIC, mortgages are up more than rents, and there's not a lot we can do about the interest rate. I know. 2023 to 24 saw private renters and mortgages reporting struggling to afford housing compared to the year before. 32% of private renters reported it being a struggle, 27% of social renters, and mortgagors at 14%. WMIC, mortgagors are paying more but struggling less. Why? Well, the actual reason will be the average household with a mortgage earns pretty much double what the average household in private rental does. So because the mortgage payments are up less than double, the mortgagors have struggled less in comparison with that, if that makes sense. 37% of households now contain someone with a long-term illness or disability, up from 34% 4 years ago. If anyone's seen dispatches from this week, Britain's benefits scandal, you might have a certain view. But be a little careful because the producer has a certain bent of his own. But you should watch it with an open mind, and it's difficult not to draw some conclusions from it. Owner-occupiers are more satisfied with life, feel life is more worthwhile, are happier and less anxious. They also feel less lonely, which is strange in a way because the average owner-occupier household has fewer people in than the average rental household. But there we go. WMIC, well, of course they do. That's the exec summary done then. Into the main course, getting the meat off the bones. The backdrop for this EHS is noted as increasing inflation, increasing interest rates, increased cost of living. All fair. Fewer renters expect to buy a home compared to 10 years ago. The conclusion here, which won't surprise anyone, and I don't see anyone really arguing against this with any success, there's a growing disparity between households. A smaller but substantial proportion of households struggling with financing and increasingly exposed to risk. And there are others with savings or equity in housing. Of the households in the UK, we now see 30% with mortgages and 35% owner-occupier with no mortgage. It was 2013-14 when the unencumbered first outnumbered the encumbered, and the direction of travel basically continues. This really needs profiling by age, though, to be as meaningful as you might like. When it comes to vacancy, there are some really mind-blowing numbers here. 509,000 vacant PRS properties. That's 10% of all the PRS stock, or a little bit more. 164,000 vacant social rent properties, 4% of the stock. 3% of owner-occupier stock is empty as well. That's another 479,000 dwellings. It's a mind-blowing tragedy, but also the greatest opportunity in the history of UK property, in my view. But of these, as an aside, around 250 to 300,000 is the industry best guess for voids at one time, about 5% of the rental stock. I'd call these frictional voids between tenancies. Just as there'll always be some people unemployed, there will always be some houses empty in the PRS. The same goes for social, you would think. and their number is 4%, which is probably the number that the PRS should be aspiring to. But have we got more empty because they're on the market for sale? Who knows? We're going to find out next year. Then the owner-occupiers, harder to say, perhaps in probate, perhaps bought to remain empty. Plenty has been, but it also might be classified as PRS. We need measures to bring these numbers down. They need to be looked at hard and potentially revolutionised. There's some stick needed here and maybe some carrot as well. 59% of social renter households now have one or more people with a long-term illness or disability. That's up from 54% in 2019-20. 30% of the PRS is the same. 26% of those with a mortgage is the same. So there are 4 chapters in this survey at the moment to get stuck into: the profile of households and dwellings, costs and affordability, history and future housing, and then well-being and loneliness, which I'm going to consider outside of the scope of this analysis. I'm sticking with analysing the first chapter this week, the demographics, so we can spend enough time on it. The rest is going to be used in future supplements in the coming month or so. So, chapter 1, what tenures do they think about? Owner-occupier with or without mortgage, private rent, social rent, and in social rent category, is it owned by the local authority or by a housing association? The one division they're missing here is a rental with or without a mortgage, which has been a huge difference, of course, in the recent years of normalising interest rates. But 24.7 million households in self-contained accommodation. This is an important distinction. Not in institutional accommodation, student, nursing homes. 16 million owner-occupiers. Owner-occupier was highest as a percentage in 2003 at 71%. It declined to 63% in 2013-14 and has come back a little bit since there to 65. PRS size 4.7 million households. This was 9 to 11% in the 80s and 90s and has been 19 or 20% since 2013-14. On the flip side, the social rented sector is half the size it was in the early 80s when it was more than 30%. Worth remembering, at that wonderful time of very cheap houses, 1980, less than 60% were owner-occupiers. So there we go. Right to buy changed that, of course. The composition has also changed a lot more than those figures suggest. 33% owner-occupier, outstripping 31% mortgagor since 2013-14. That ratio has now progressed to 35-30, as we said earlier. In 13-14, 17% was social rent, which was split 10% housing association, 7% local authority. That's now 10 and 6. So 10% 10 years ago was 2.3 million. Now it's 2.5 million. But 100,000 fewer households rent from the local authority compared to 10 years ago. That'll be the difference between, again, right to buy activations and then right to buy receipts being reinvested in new social homes built by the local authority. 100,000 fewer. You can see why they've changed the rules around right to buy. The tenure trends are ones that we all know, but it is interesting to actually measure them out. They then introduce the distinction between London and not London. Now, it's done as a binary choice. It always makes a difference. 32% of London households are private renters, compared to 17% in the rest of England. That's basically twice as many. Local authority renters are also at 10% in London, compared to 6% in the rest of England. So again, nearly twice as likely. That leaves 47% owner-occupier in London, compared to 68% in the rest of England. 22% own outright, 25% owner-occupiers with a mortgage. So in London, the bias is more towards mortgage than unencumbered, unlike the rest of England, where 38% own outright and 30% have got a mortgage but are owner-occupiers. And look, the median age in London is also lower, so it isn't all just about house prices, because age obviously has an impact when it comes to tenure. Now the survey focuses on what's called the HRP, the Household Reference Person. This is the householder in whose name the accommodation is owned or rented. This leads to some interesting revelations. 30% of households have an HRP above 65. 3% have an HRP in the 16 to 24 age group. The other age bands split between 15 and 18%. When it comes to owner-occupiers, 36% are over 65. When it comes to social renters, however, 29% are over 65. They are the most common in both of those two bands. Only 9% of HRPs in the PRS were 65 or over. Now the age bands they consider are 16 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, 45 to 54, 55 to 64, and 65 plus. It won't surprise you to know the older you are, the more likely you are to be an unencumbered owner-occupier. Because let's face it, that's how mortgages work, right? However, the 73.4% of 65 plus HRPs that own outright are down from a high of 74.9% in 2020 to 21. It's housing association rentals that have picked up that difference in the past 4 years. 55 to 64s own outright 44.2% of the time, and are owner-occupiers with a mortgage 27.3% of the time. Of that age demographic, 11% rent privately, and 17.5% rent socially. Go down just one age band, and only 19.6% own outright, with 47.6% having a mortgage. The percentage in social rent is really very consistent, apart from in the 25 to 34 age band, where it drops to 14.3%. In that age band, 40.3% of households privately rent, versus 16 to 24 households, in which 66.7% privately rent. So this is who the PRS serves, as a rule. The next observation is very different from the typical narrative. Over the past 10 years, there are 17% of households in the 16 to 24 age bracket that are owner-occupiers, compared to only 9% 10 years ago. This is similar in the 25 to 34 age bracket. 45% are owner-occupier compared to 36% 10 years ago. The decreases in the 55 to 64 age bracket, that's 71% down from 76, but 11% in the PRS compared to 8% 10 years ago. So before you go around believing it's impossible to get on the ladder these days, etc., as the papers would say, I think it's incredibly impressive 17% of households in the 16 to 24 bracket are owner-occupiers. And I think if you ask people about 25 to 34, they wouldn't think that nearly half are owner-occupiers as well. Vastly improved on 10 years ago. But there we go. Some probably unsurprising news next. Single households are the largest household type in the social rented sector. 21% are one male, 26% are one female. This is the least common household type in England in households that buy with a mortgage. That's 11% are one male and 8% are one female. Now, outright owners are much more likely to be a single female. 25% one female, 16% one male. Now, perhaps this is due to life expectancy alongside other factors. But in the PRS, 20% are single male, 13% are single female. Single person households have comparatively rocketed as well since the pandemic. It was 13% single male, 15% single female in 2019 to 20. It's now 16 and 18% respectively. This has a knock-on effect, of course, on the average number of people per household. That's now 2.2 compared to 2.4 5 years ago. People with a mortgage have 2.7 people per household. Private renters have 2.3. Outright owners have a household size of 1.8 on average. In the PRS, households with an HRP from a minority ethnic background went from 18% in 1920 to 30% in 23-24. That's a 60% increase or so, but that would certainly match with the profile of what we've seen across our rental group in the past 5 years. And of course it tessellates in with the very high net migration figures. In all households, the HRP works full-time 50% of the time, part-time 11% of the time, and is retired 29% of the time. 2% are unemployed, 1% are in full-time education, and 7% are other inactive, i.e. a long-term illness or disability. 93% of owner-occupiers have an HRP in full or part-time work, perhaps unsurprisingly. In private rentals, that drops to 76%. In social rentals, the HRP is in full-time work only 27% of the time, down from 31% 4 years ago. This is reflective of the move from 54 to 59% of HRPs in social rented properties living with a long-term disability, or a long-term illness. The weekly household income by tenure is better discussed as a graph. It contains no surprises in parts, but private renters are quite evenly split across income distributions. So I've used this as this week's graph if you want to look the supplement up on my LinkedIn or on the Partners in Property website on the blog section. Mortgages are much more common in higher income quintiles. Of course they are. Outright owners are split relatively evenly across the bands, and indeed the fewest fit into the highest income quintile. Social renters look diametrically opposite to those who own with a mortgage. Again, you'd wonder why anyone in the top quintile of income needs to be in a socially rented property, But likewise, you wonder how anyone in the bottom quintile has a mortgage. But the answer is, of course, both of them started off with a very different income profile when they started that tenure. That's bound to be the answer. We've moved from 34% of households to 37% of households who have someone living with a long-term illness or disability. This increase has played out across all tenures. 94% have internet access. Yep, only 94, up from 90% 4 years ago. But this breaks back to social rent, who 85% have internet, which is up from 79. Mortgagors are at 99% with internet access, but still only 99%. The next section is often under-discussed: dwelling age. Private rentals tend to be older, and no one's surprised to hear that. Buildings built pre-1919, which is this distinction that doesn't move in spite of becoming 1 year older every year the survey takes place. 31% of PRS stock was built pre-1919. 20% of owner-occupied stock and 7% of socially rented dwellings were the same. 29% of socially rented dwellings were built between 1945 and 1964. This was, of course, the boom for social stock. Only 11% of the PRS stock was built in that era, and 16% of owner-occupied stock was built in that period as well. Housing association stock is far newer than local authority stock. 32% of housing association stock has been built since 1991, compared to only 7% of local authority stock. 8% of housing association stock was built pre-1919 though, and only 4% of local authority stock was. 25% of owner-occupied stock is detached, compared to 5% of PRS and 1% of social. A social home is most likely to be a low-rise, purpose-built flat. That represents 37% of the sector. It also represents 25% of the PRS and only 7% of owner-occupied dwellings. High-rise flats are also more likely to be local authority stock. That makes up 7% of their stock, compared to housing association, which is about 4% of their stock. So let's talk about size then. The average usable floor space is 96 square metres. It's 66 square metres for social rent and 75 square metres for private rents, with owner-occupier homes at 110 square metres on average. 25% of socially rented stock is below 50 square metres. 19% of PRS stock is below 50 square metres. Only 3% of owner-occupier homes are below 50 square metres, which is one to bear in mind when considering selling flats of a certain size. And it puts a spin on why lenders might not consider the split value of a block, for example. But if you looked at London versus not London here, of course you'd come to a different conclusion. 82% of dwellings have private outdoor space, 16% have a shared plot. That leaves 1%, anyone paying attention will realise that should really be 2%, but of course there's rounding errors in these surveys, so they have none of either, 1% of dwellings. But that 82% breaks back to 61% in London of private outdoor space and 86% in not London. But then 16% shared breaks back to 34 in London and 13 in not London. Perhaps there's a lot of unsurprising data in here. Social homes are smaller, they're more occupied per square metre, and they're much more likely to be occupied by those on lower incomes, or someone with a long-term illness or disability, which obviously goes hand in hand. But that's the point of social rents, right? Single people are much more likely to rent than own. This is most definitely the housing market we've lived in for at least the last 20 years, if not more. It's a straightforward price versus income scenario. The directions of travel, however, over the past 4 years are quite stark. Much more disability or long-term illness comparatively, fewer people per household, 10% fewer in just 4 years. Dramatic increases in the HRPs being from a minority ethnic background, which, as I've said, just has to be the case when you consider net migration of the past few years. I don't see any other conclusions to be drawn there, but it is worth reiterating that, of course, minority ethnic HRPs are much more likely to be renting than buying, compared to households that have been in the UK for generations. The picture in London remains very different from the not London segment, although some of that will behave very much like London, but most will behave completely differently. I'd love to go down another level on that data, but we can't at this time. Other unsurprising conclusions are that age is the big factor for owner-occupiers, although fewer are ended up unencumbered than a few years ago. And also far more households are owner-occupier at the 16 to 24 and 25 to 34 level than the majority of people think, mostly based on mainstream media narratives around the impossibility of home ownership. I do need to bear in mind, after bringing this data smorgasbord to a close, that this also only runs until March 2024. There's more been happening since then in terms of what I've seen of landlords shifting ex-PRS stock. These 1.2 million empty dwellings, and please remember this is only England, right? Not the whole of the UK. This is the eye-watering number for us to really reflect on and also attempt to do something about from a commercial, sustainability and moral perspective, in my view anyway. It's definitely a part of my focus going forward. So here we are again at the end, and a reminder that tickets for the next Property Business Workshop are out Thursday 16th of January 2025, still can't believe it, with some great subject matter, planning, efficiencies, financial accounting and bookkeeping. We're not going to sit there and teach you how to use Xero. We're talking about setting up reporting correctly, or making sure it's set up correctly for you, and then how to monitor it on an effective ongoing monthly basis. Come along, get your strategic planning sorted out, and get your January kick up the backside as part of the package as well. Early bird tickets are still out, 10% face value discount on them. Once they're gone, they're gone. These events do sell out. Rod and I would love to see you there. Please buy one at bit.ly/PBW5. There's also a link down in the show notes. Now, we all know there's only one way to deal with all of this ongoing noise and excitement. Keep calm, always be listening to the supplement, and carry on. Thank you.